Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to welcome, I guess, first time guest to whatever this is. I want to welcome David Harris. He is the Executive Director of Jewish Cemeteries of Greater Cincinnati, also known as JCGC by its acronym. So, David, welcome.
Thanks so much, Drew. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and answer any questions I can, share a little bit of information in general about Jewish Cemeteries of Greater Cincinnati. You know, a lot of people don't know that JCGC, as our initials are called, although sometimes we're just referring ourselves now as Jewish Cemeteries to try to get out of the alphabet soup of the Jewish community.
It's inescapable, though.
It seems to be inescapable, indeed.
It's inevitable.
So Jewish Cemeteries of Greater Cincinnati, we manage now 25 Jewish cemeteries here in Cincinnati, in the Greater Cincinnati region. And we're the result of a really community lay-led effort that took about 10 years in the making to get all of the Jewish cemeteries really in the region to become a part of this new association that was going to be like an umbrella organization for all of them. And that's a really unique model that didn't exist anyplace else in the country at the time. And in fact, I still spend actually quite a bit of my time fielding calls from other communities around the country that are calling and saying, how did you guys do that there? And how do we replicate that in some manner? Mm-hmm. So it really is something to be proud of here that we have this unique organization. Collectively, there are 35,000 graves that we maintain. And we always talk about how we're really honored and blessed to have this important role serving our community's burial needs, maintaining the graves of our loved ones in the community. We touch a lot of families, obviously, and they're the descendants of all these loved ones. And we have a real responsibility and pride in maintaining the cemeteries in their honor and memory. We also have, though, sort of an expanded role, which is maybe highlighted by this 200th anniversary year that we're in. We're celebrating the Jewish Cincinnati Bicentennial, which all started with the founding of the Chestnut Street Cemetery in 1821. That was the first Jewish organization in the community. And really from there, everything else sprang. So we also talk about how while we have this role that we play, obviously this primary responsibility with the graves of individuals, we also have like this collective community history role that we play because the community's history is really enshrined in the cemeteries, right? It's on the shoulders of all the people who came before us and built this community that we now have this wonderful Jewish community that we live in. So it's great to be here with you and share a little bit of that and also answer any questions I can.
Wonderful. And when did that sort of all come together? When was the rise of JCGC?
So officially, the organization was incorporated in 2004, and we began operations officially in 2008. So there was a little bit of time while the organization was brought into existence. And then there was sort of a lot of, as you can imagine, various legal machinations and mergers and agreements that needed to be sought on a legal level to actually dissolve those previously existing cemetery organizations, whether they were run by congregations in many cases, or in some cases, there were individual burial societies that existed. This is common in lots of places in the country. There were these Landskraftmen, these workers cooperatives that existed that created basically mutual aid societies in order for people who may not have been a member of a congregation, but who wanted the benefits of being buried in a Jewish cemetery to be able to pay a certain amount every year as a membership due. And then when you passed away, you were entitled to certain benefits, which often included a grave and funeral cost. And so all of those entities had to actually officially be dissolved in order for the merger to occur and be able to create one organization that now oversaw everything. So between 2004 and 2008 is when all that happened. And then 2008 was official beginning of operations.
Wow. And on top of all of that, it's not just organizations consolidating, it's also a bunch of real estate. So that's definitely very contract intensive.
It's the real estate. It's also, if you imagine, each of the cemeteries had their own particular rules and regulations.
Oh, wow.
And in some cases, part of the merger deal that was struck, and this was not an unreasonable thing, one of the big concerns from the community members and really in particular from the rabbis was how do we know that this new organization is going to respect the rules and rituals of our particular cemetery? And so that was struck as a piece of the original deal, that whatever rules or ritual practices pertain to a particular cemetery are still maintained until this day and always will be.
Oh, wow.
But beyond that, there's other policies and procedures that were different between the cemeteries that aren't really ritual related. And those we had to find a way to reconcile, right? We couldn't have everybody have their own pricing for different cemeteries and have different rules about what kinds of monuments can be there and all the various, ways that we operate in general. That all had to be reconciled to create one cohesive organization, which is what we now have. And I'll say also, if you'll allow me to go on for another minute, because I just love talking about this, it's a really special organization in that we have representatives on our board from across the community, from all the various different religious movements, including people who are not affiliated, and that we really serve the whole community. And so there's a real great sense of respect that exists between everybody. It's one of the only places in the community where you have an organization that really does have that breadth of representation. And even though you're dealing with, this is a life cycle matter, which means that it's very personal. There are lots of different practices between the movements and everybody has different backgrounds. And yet the way that the board has always operated, and they're all very proud of it, as am I, is with their community hat on, despite their own personal preferences. And so everybody's always looking out for, well, what is the best interest of the community as a whole? And so it's a special organization in that way.
That's really great. And how it's what, 98% of the Jewish cemeteries. It's not exactly, it's not a full monopoly, right?
There is one Jewish cemetery in the community that has not joined the association.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So all but one.
All but one.
All but one. Okay. And
as far as we know, there are, as we've been doing some history research, we're discovering potentially old cemeteries that existed in parts of downtown that we're not sure whether it's just misinformation in the newspapers of the day or somebody having an address wrong about where a cemetery may have been located. They were referring to the Chestnut Street Cemetery, but for some reason they had a different address attached to it. Oh, wow. So, but yes, as far as we know, all of the cemeteries minus this one.
That's great. And how long have you worked for JCGC?
I'm coming up on my 5-year anniversary here.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
So almost half of your time there has been the pandemic.
It's really true. I mean, at least, certainly 2 years of my time here has been during the pandemic. I'm grateful that I had, 3 years almost before that to get my feet under me. My poor office manager that I have now, a wonderful office manager, but poor in the sense that unfortunate that she came on in January of 2020. And so only had about 6 weeks or so before things went a little bit different than we all expected.
Wow. Okay. So, taking us back to the before times, before 2 years ago, how had the operations of JCGC been, sort of in a broad sense, before we get to the pandemic? So sort of how did that run and how did that work?
So, everybody, each of the rabbis in the community and other clergy members who perform burials, they all actually have sort of a unique way in which they run their burial services. As you can imagine. And so there was certainly some tailoring that went on depending upon who was running the service. And also, of course, there are some differences, generally, broadly speaking, between the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox practices. But by and large, the way that things would operate is that we would arrive to this, when the hearse and the casket, assuming that it's a casket burial, would arrive to the cemetery. We would allow for family members and friends of the deceased to serve as pallbearers, to carry the casket to the grave. And then after our staff lowers the casket into the grave, at some point there would be an opportunity, generally at most services, for people to use a shovel to help fill in the grave, which is, a big part of our Jewish tradition. It's a very difficult thing to do. You do it reluctantly, but that mitzvah that we have to really assist in the burial of a loved one is a chesed shel emet, we say, a true act of kindness, in that it is one that can never be repaid. There's no reciprocity opportunity there, of course. And so it's something that you do for somebody without any expectation of there ever being any reciprocity. And so that's a big part of our tradition. And it's a big part, I think, for families. One of the reasons I believe, and you as a rabbi can probably enlighten me to this, but I believe that, taking a step back, I'll say that I have always been fascinated and in reverence of our rabbinic sages in the ways in which they crafted the entire process around burial and mourning in our tradition. There are a lot of things that, I'll be honest to say, I scratch my head about the rabbis and what they decided and why they decided this and that.
Yeah.
But this one, I think they got really right. And I'm always amazed, that this is, the level of psychological understanding that they had in a pre-Freudian world is like amazing to me, right? So I think that one of the reasons, in my opinion, that there is this notion of wanting to fill in the grave is it's something for the family to recognize that they themselves are doing this act, and it is an acknowledgement that you cannot escape when the sound of the earth falls on the casket of a loved one. It's closure. I mean, you understand that person is not with us anymore, and you have to come to grips with that. And so I think that is a piece of the process. So all of those traditions, I think, are really important. And as I'm guessing we're going to discuss, they are some of those things that changed in the pandemic.
And another aspect which takes place prior to the cemeteries is there were often services that would take place at the funeral home, right? Eulogies and so forth. And then from there, people would then go for the burial.
Sure.
This is all pre-pandemic.
Yeah, in the pre-pandemic times, most people, not all, there were services that did only occur graveside, but most of the time services do take place either at the funeral home, walk-on funeral home, or at one of the congregations in some cases. And there would be a more lengthy service, usually with more eulogies and opportunities for honoring the deceased.
Wow. Okay. So 2 years ago, mid-March happens. So I know you sent out a document on March 19th, 2020. But how did you, and that obviously had to take into account, and this was still early on pandemic when we thought everything would just shut down for 2-3 weeks, right? And we'd all go back to normal by Passover 2020. So in your crafting this document, or what happened? Right, from your perspective, this is the first week of the pandemic. People were literally not leaving their homes. What happened?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I don't know that myself or my staff members or many of our colleagues in the community understood that JCGC, Jewish Cemeteries of Greater Cincinnati, is one of those essential services that cannot shut down.
Right.
You might want to edit this part out, but you can't bury people remotely. It was challenging to recognize right away that there wasn't an option for JCGC staff people to work from home. We needed to be at the office. We were actually very concerned, even early on, about what a pandemic would mean for our organization and the level of the number of burials that, God forbid, we might have to perform.
Oh, wow.
Because even in those early days in March, it was already clear that the pandemic was going to be serious. And certainly by April, when the numbers in New York were looking so horrific, we had a great fear here. So we knew that we couldn't work remotely. We did try to keep our staff in separate crews. So we split the staff up into 2 different crews to try to limit exposure, and such if one crew became infected, hopefully we would have a second crew that would still be available. We did our best to keep our distance from one another in the office. There were only 2, myself and an office manager at the time, who worked in the office. So we were able to manage that fairly well. And we knew that there were going to need to be changes made quickly. I am also not only a member, but a proud board member of the Jewish Cemetery Association of North America, which is a membership organization of Jewish cemeteries from around the North American continent. And we were quickly in touch with one another about what this would mean, what kinds of protocols we should put in place, what other cemeteries were doing, Jewish and non-Jewish, and quickly started to develop our own, each organization developed its own protocols, but we were able to share best practices and knowledge and information with one another across the country, which was extremely helpful.
Great. So you then put out this document in like within the first week of the pandemic. So, and it, you did it in obviously in concert with Wild Con, the local Jewish funeral home, monitoring the situation.
And also with our local rabbis. So I was in touch with our rabbinic Vaad here in Cincinnati, as well as the Council of Congregational Rabbis, as well as the Chevra Kadisha, to make sure that along with Wildcon Funeral Home, we were all on the same page. It was one of the very important points that we wanted to clarify before we ever issued this document, was that everybody had to be in lockstep on this, because there was no way to ensure that these protocols would be enforced if we weren't. And so that was a big piece of how we, even before we sent this out, what had gone on behind the scenes.
That's really good. That's really good. Do you mind if I read the burial and services protocols? Great.
Please.
Okay, so we will continue. For those who are struggling to read this on screen, I'll read it for people's benefit. We will continue to perform all scheduled burials and unveilings at JCGC cemeteries, but subject to specific protocols. We do not take these steps lightly, and we understand the break from tradition and practice that we are initiating. We ask for your cooperation and understanding as we initiate the following protocols. 1. All services will be conducted graveside. If a family insists on a service at Wildcon Funeral Home, Wildcon Funeral Home will allow no more than 10 attendees with 6 feet minimum distance between them. However, Wildcon Funeral Home's official policy is to discourage chapel services. Number 2, at our cemeteries, no more than 15 people may attend a graveside service or unveiling, and they must keep 6 feet of distance between one another. Preferably, only closest family members / primary mourners should attend. As minyanim and therefore kaddish have been suspended elsewhere, it is permissible to suspend the practice graveside as well. Should a family wish to have a minyan, according to their tradition, for the purpose of saying kaddish at the grave, they should take that into account of the 15 people allowed to attend. Number 3, at burials, JCGC and Wildcon Funeral Home staff will carry the casket from the hearse to the grave, as opposed to allowing pallbearers. Pallbearers may follow behind, again, keeping 6 feet of distance between one another and staff. Number 4, the tradition of putting dirt in the grave, either symbolically or for the mitzvah associated with completely covering the grave, is being suspended. Our safety protocols require that our staff assist this process normally, which would require them to come into close contact with the public if this practice was to be allowed. And I'm also just going to follow this up with grave sales and pre-planning meetings. They're in-person appointments to assist families where death has occurred or is imminent, but pre-need sales appointments will be scheduled at the discretion of JCGC and Wildcon Funeral Home. So there are certainly changes. And how long did these protocols remain in place?
Well, altogether, I would say that we really only truly lifted everything, in the last 2 weeks, really since the end of the Omicron variant.
Although, there were some
there were some changes in terms of some exceptions to the number of people we were allowing to be graveside. Wildcon Funeral Home had decided to allow more services to occur at the funeral home upon request, and with more people attending than what that original document had indicated. But altogether, the protocols overall were in place until recently. I only recently approved our staff to again allow pallbearers from the family and to allow people to use a shovel to fill in the grave. We had been providing a cup full of dirt to allow family members to throw some dirt into the grave, but we only recently really lifted everything.
Okay, so I still remember, because of my work here, I often throughout the pandemic attended Zoom funerals, and I remember I think the first time I saw an in-person one was maybe December 2020. It could have been January 2021. So it was just as people were getting vaccinations were coming out. It was a tough time. I do you see, and I know there have been some little changes along the way. If you don't mind, I'm going to share another email. So this was back in October of 2021. So we have some change. I don't know if were there any changes made spring, summer 2021 as it was entirely going away, of course, before Delta.
We were about to issue changes, and then things ramped up again, and we just left everything as it was.
Yeah. Okay.
So this was a change. You're right with this document.
So we have this October 2021. So this is post holidays 2021. If you don't mind, I'm also going to read the updated protocols for.
Sure.
Okay. And this is, I mean, just for context, this is people are primarily vaccinated for the most part. This is still during Delta season. This is pre-Omicron. And dear this is something you sent to rabbis and clergy members, but I hope this finds you well. Like all of you, we have been pressed to acknowledge that things are not back to normal. While we recognize that the majority of community members are vaccinated and that imposing limitations on gatherings is increasingly difficult. I mean, obviously, there's been over a year and a half, of the pandemic. We are still concerned about protecting the health of you and our staff members and of community members. Therefore, and this is where it gets exciting, the following protocols are being established or continued. Services at Wildcon Funeral Home and gravesite in the cemeteries will be limited to 30 people. So already there's an acknowledgement, not only that there are services, as well as taking place indoors at Wildcon, but also now it's a limit of 30. So it's not just trying to stick to 10, 15, it's now up to 30. All attendees must wear a mask at either location. And that's even graveside? Even outdoors
graveside?
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we did at least try to insist on that graveside.
Right. The reality, obviously, who knows, especially outdoors.
It's very, we can talk about all of these for sure. I mean, I'll just say that, a community rabbi made one of the smartest or most insightful comments I've ever heard about the Jewish people, which is that there's only one rule really for the Jewish people.
Ignore the rabbis.
And that is that everybody thinks that they're an exception.
Oh, there we go. It was close enough to my ignore the rabbis thing, but yes, you nailed it.
So, at some point, it's sort of like it became really challenging to limit the number of people, because there was this acknowledgement that everybody who's going to be there is vaccinated, for example.
Right.
But still, one of the things that I noticed early on in the pandemic, and still was a concern, is that despite people's best intentions, perhaps, when it comes to being at a funeral for a loved one in a moment of grief, there was a tendency for people to simply throw caution to the wind, to say, you know what, I know that I'm not supposed to hug you because you're not in my bubble, but there's just no way I'm not going to hug my brother-in-law at our aunt's funeral or whatever.
Right.
And just they would allow themselves to do something that really they shouldn't have been doing and knew that they shouldn't have been doing, but they were sort of giving themselves a pass. And we all wanted that. We all wanted to hug people that we hadn't seen in a while. And people were, not using the funeral as an excuse to do that. But again, just feeling like I'm just not going to let that thing dictate my life during this moment of grief. Right. And they gave themselves a pass. And so in some ways, some of the rules and protocols that we were kept in place, including mask wearing at the cemeteries, even for a graveside service, which is outdoors, even after the vaccine, was to try to help people remember to really be extra cautious still. I know that, we also wanted to make sure that we were messaging that we still took this seriously, that we have a responsibility to protect. This was for the protection of people attending the service, but quite frankly, these protocols were primarily in place to make sure that our staff remained safe and could continue to perform services for other families and didn't risk infection at one family's service because of their particular desire to do things the way they wanted to do them, and as well as protecting the staff of Wildcon Funeral Home, and quite frankly, also all of our clergy members. And so we really took that seriously as a responsibility that we have, that we wanted to send a message that we are taking this seriously, and we want to just sort of be an extra little bit cautious, perhaps, but also we had a responsibility to protect our staff and our colleagues.
Yeah, that's good. I also imagine a lot of that might have already changed by the spring of 2021 and summer, especially as vaccinations were more widespread. And at that time, we believed you couldn't catch COVID if you already were vaccinated. So
Right.
people's probably going based on what you just said about the exceptions. I'm already vaccinated. I don't need a distance. I don't need to wear a mask. I don't need. Blah, 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 blah.
That's right.
Yeah. Although I can tell here, I mean, you say in the funeral home, attendees will be asked to practice social distancing from those with whom they do not share a residence. But at least here, there's no expectation of social distancing outside, just more indoors, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
We acknowledge that, at least the evidence and the science at the time was saying that outdoors is great. There's
Right.
very low risk, etc.
Right. And this is already
But
a year and a half into the pandemic. We had learned so much more than that
It's
March
true.
2020.
It's true. But, I mean, there were things to consider even within this, in the sense that, often we have a tent canopy set up at funeral services.
Mhm.
And even though if those sides on the tent were closed down,
Mhm.
even though you're outside, you're sort of still in an enclosed area, right? And so
Yeah.
people in their minds are saying, I'm outside, but you're not really outside. You're still, I mean, yes, you're not within a building, permanent structure, but so yes, there were nuances to still consider here.
Yeah. And speaking of that tent, I mean, the next line says at the cemetery, 10 to 15 attendees will be allowed under the tent / close to the grave. Additional gravesite attendees will be asked to keep their distance back from the gravesite, not necessarily from other people, but just from the graveside. JCGC will provide umbrellas if necessary to accommodate those not under the tent in inclement weather. So, when did you start instituting this tent?
We've always set up a tent at services.
Oh, okay.
Almost every service has a tent set up, unless it's just such a beautiful, clear day and the weather is such that it's just would be ridiculous to set up a tent almost.
Mm-hmm.
But we almost always have a tent set up just in case.
Okay, that's really nice.
In the summertime to protect from sun, in the wintertime to protect from rain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some cemeteries, the grave may be located in an area where it's difficult to set up a tent, so it may not happen at every single service, but it's our general practice.
Mm-hmm. That's great. We have two more lines. Unless insisted upon by the family, staff will serve as pallbearers. So you kept that in place. Unless insisted upon by the family, attendees may throw a cup of dirt into the grave still rather than using the shovel, which necessitates close contact between staff and attendees for safety reasons. Now we're going to throw an if a shovel is going to be used, only one person at a time will be allowed near the grave. So now you have the shovel coming into play, but there still is largely a cup of dirt for most of the attendees.
Yeah, there was, if you remember back to the early days of the pandemic, and I laugh about this every time I think about it now, but there was a real fear about transmission occurring from objects.
Right.
And so I don't know about you, but I have these very ridiculous memories of coming into the office and laying out mail on the floor.
We did the same thing at home. We would quarantine mail for a few days before we'd even open it.
Right. Yeah. I would lay it out on the floor. I'd spray it down with an alcohol bottle. I mean, it was, I would catch myself and I would just start laughing like, what world are we living in?
By the way, when we my wife would bring groceries home, she would have to wipe everything down with Lysol wipes. Nothing could just come in because we were afraid of the germs. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, and at the time that's the way the world was. So we had planned on not having the shovels being passed back and forth between people regardless. However, the main reason, and people have not always understood this despite it being written clearly there into the protocols and into this statement, the main reason why we weren't allowing the shovel was not because of the fear of transmission, but because when community members use a shovel to fill in the grave, they inevitably have to be very close to the grave. And in order to ensure that nobody takes a bad step and falls into the grave or otherwise hurts themselves, our staff are always there. If you've ever been to one of our services, you'll notice our staff are very close by, actually spotting people. In some case, In some cases, literally with their hands, about to grab somebody by the waist, should they start to stumble.
Oh, wow.
And so that kind of close contact is really what we were fearing during this period. And the other piece with the, in the email that you were showing, where I say only one person at a time, that's the same reason. There was, especially in graveside services, in particular in the Orthodox community, where there is a responsibility felt to fill the grave entirely by hand by the people that are there attending the service.
Yeah, I saw one of those.
In cold weather, there's a tendency to let's get this done quickly. And you might have 4 or 5 people standing close together trying to fill the grave as quickly as possible. And that's
I saw one in October 2020 of one of our residents. I went, and although I had to stay far away because I'm a Kohen, but it was a lot different than the regular funerals that I had seen.
Yes, it was. And so we needed to find a way to make sure we could continue to be safe in that manner, even if we were going to allow the shovel to be used. Yeah. It's a very difficult thing, though.
Yeah. And like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of emotions at the same time as well. Even though these are not part of the protocols, I still want to mention a little bit here of this email where you say, given the opening up we see all around us, this is already fall 2021. And especially given that services in the cemeteries are outdoors, we recognize that these protocols may seem unnecessarily restrictive. Again, our concern is for you, our staff, and those attending. We all know that at times of grief, people are prone to letting down their guard, as you mentioned earlier. Setting clear rules and expectations from the beginning with families will help ensure everyone's safety. And then this is very specific to the rabbinic audience of your email. I also recognize that your role is first and foremost to be a comfort to families. I am available to speak with any family members who have questions or take issue with these protocols. Your cooperation and support throughout the pandemic continues to be a source of pride and a model for other communities, and is greatly appreciated by our staff in the field. And this is all pre-Omicron.
That's right. The biggest thing for me personally, I will say, other than the bizarre things like wiping down our mail, the biggest change for me during the pandemic was that during I'd say probably the first year, I attended every service in our cemeteries, and that's not something I normally do. Not because it's not something that I think is important, but it's simply not necessary given the wonderful relationship that we have, first and foremost, with Wildcon Funeral Home, and second, of course, the incredible field staff that we have, who are our pride and joy in terms of how they represent JCGC to our community, how they care for our family members, how they respect and honor our traditions and help to preserve those. It's just something that isn't a necessary part of my job description. And I feel that my role can be better served by other duties generally. During the pandemic, I made a point of going for 2 reasons. One, I did feel, rather than it being on the funeral home staff and certainly not on clergy to be the enforcers of these policies, I felt like it was good for me to be there and be able to play that role if necessary. The second thing, and really in conjunction with that, was to be able to express to the families very heartfelt how difficult I know these changes are. And how difficult it is, we know that they can't have everybody with them at the cemetery to honor their loved one. And that if the weather's bad, it means that the eulogy might not be as long as it would be otherwise, and therefore honoring their loved one. And that there is something that we are taking away by not allowing them to be the pallbearers and not allowing them to fill in the grave. These are difficult things. I get emotional thinking about it now. These are difficult things, and I wanted to express personally to the families how much we knew we were asking them to give up in this process and how difficult it was, but how much we really appreciated and depended on their cooperation. So that was a really big change. I'm grateful that, we have an amazing community of professionals and lay leaders. My rabbinic colleagues in the rabbinic community, I should say. I certainly am not one of those. the cooperation and support that they gave
Mm-hmm.
has been tremendous throughout this entire process. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it still was nonetheless, I thought, important for me to be there. I'm glad that they and the community were really quite understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, despite it being difficult, appreciated that we were looking out for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, it was no longer necessary, I felt, for me to be at every service because the protocols were well understood and established, and everybody sort of was on the same page for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a very interesting time.
And especially 2021 was very up and down when it came to the pandemic. We had the exuberance of the spring vaccinations, and the numbers went way down by May and June. But then we have the rise of Delta August through kind of the fall.
Yeah.
And that's all pre-Omicron. So there must have been definitely a roller coaster when it came to not only the protocols and precautions, but just sort of where people's heads were at.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. And then we have the rise of Omicron throughout the winter. But now we're at a place, we're in a much better place. I mean, the numbers are way down back to where they were May, June 2021. So significantly down. And now we have, we're in a different spot. And you just came out recently, just this month, actually, with a new set of protocols. Now, this is another email to rabbis and clergy members. Mm-hmm. Some updates. So signage noting that masks are required will remain posted at the funeral home, at Wildcon Funeral Home, though masks will be optional in reality, which is in keeping with new CDC guidelines. That's really more of a new CDC thing. After, I think, between Delta and Omicron, those were definitely placed indoors, but now with until we get the next variant, but those are largely not really taking place. We are lifting all COVID-19 protocols in the cemeteries. That's huge for the first time in 2 years. This means that masks, while encouraged for any at-risk individuals, will not be required. Pallbearers will be permitted, again, for the first time in 2 years. Use of the shovels to fill graves will be allowed. So, of course, you then make sure to say, should the situation require us to reinstitute any mitigation measures, we will work with you, and so forth, which, who knows what's next. At this point, we're just along for the ride. But this is from March 2020 to March 2022. That really is the 2 year span of all of these, between the pallbearers, the shovels. But it seems to be, so now things are going back to sort of pre-March 2020 practices and protocols, precautions. And one thing that I heard about, and I know, so throughout the pandemic, I've been able to watch a lot of the funerals on Zoom, but now that's not really taking place anymore, right? The graveside services are mostly not being live streamed for families or other people to watch, correct?
So that is the case. I believe that they are not being live streamed generally, at least the graveside service. I believe that in many cases, services at the funeral home or at a congregation are still being live streamed. I think that because that has been live streamed, that part, if you think back to before the pandemic, in the before times, many people would attend a service at the funeral home. A smaller number of people would always go to the cemetery. It was not the case that everybody who attended the funeral at the funeral home would then necessarily follow to the cemetery. Yeah. And so it's sort of, I think families have decided, and this is really a decision that families make. I'm sure that, first of all, the people who provided that streaming was Wildcon Funeral Home, not JCGC, although we helped facilitate it any way we could, of course. But it was really them that would provide that service. And I'm sure they still would and will, if anybody wishes to, probably indefinitely, because one of the things that we did realize, I think all of us in the world, right, is that the ability to stream things allows people to participate who may not otherwise be able to participate, even in the before times wouldn't have been able to. So, in the Jewish tradition, we often bury family members or loved ones as soon as possible. In many cases, it would be prohibited for people to fly in from long distances in order to attend. And so they just simply always missed the funeral in the before times. Now we can actually have people be included and be able to participate in some way with this technology.
Right. And certainly for the first year and a half of the pandemic, a lot of people weren't going to bother flying. It's not
That's
a money
right.
thing. It's just the exposure to so many different people, even when masked, but you don't know what's flying around.
Correct. And so now that people are traveling again
Mm-hmm.
and can make arrangements, I think if they want to and need to in order to get to places, I think it is becoming much less common to stream the service, certainly not the graveside services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Aside from the protocols, I know you mentioned earlier in this conversation about getting ready in March 2020 pandemic. You saw the New York numbers. Were there sort of you had at least a few years that you could compare and contrast to the numbers of burials taking place within JCGC properties, cemeteries. Were the first 2 years significantly higher as far as burials than your first couple 2-3 years?
So it's very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I count my blessings every day.
Mm-hmm.
We had a larger number of burials in 2020 than a typical year,
Mm-hmm.
but not vastly larger.
Mm.
And people are often very surprised by that and perplexed. Let me be clear.
Wait, you
that
said 2020, right?
2020 leading into 2021.
Okay.
I mean, 2021 is not different from that, but 2020 was when the threat seemed like it could have been huge.
Right. I mean, the reason I asked about 2021, not only because it's a full year, but also because Omicron was just so widespread and Delta was more deadly. So that's why I was asking for numbers for 2021.
So I think that there's a few things going on here, right? Number one, I don't know the numbers on it, so I'm sure somebody has run them. My perception and belief is that the Jewish community was probably at a much higher vaccination rate than the general population.
Yeah.
And so I think that is and was certainly a factor, certainly for 2021. I think that if there was an increase or a large number of deaths in other communities in 2021 versus 2020 even, I think that the reason in Cincinnati at least, or in the Jewish community at least, and I know this is true really from my colleagues around the country as well, they did not have the same numbers in 2021 as other communities. They had lower numbers because the Jewish population overall, I think, was more vaccinated. A higher percentage was vaccinated than the general population. I don't know if you know that for a fact, but you sounded like you agreed that may be the case.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers either, but it makes a lot of cultural sense, socio-cultural sense.
Yes.
And by the way, I'm just even thinking about what we've seen throughout Omicron, which is just here in Ohio itself. It was the most, especially in January, it was the most daily deaths. It was the highest at any point in the entire pandemic for Ohio. But I didn't notice, certainly not at Cedar Village. It wasn't, and because since most people were vaccinated, it really just wasn't an issue.
Now, going back to 2020, when the numbers looked like they could have been just horrific. I mean, if you think about what was happening in New York, there were numbers being projected for the Cincinnati Jewish community of potentially 500 deaths in our community in the first 6 months of the pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Okay. In an average year, our Jewish community, our cemeteries, we perform approximately 150 burials on average, I would say. Okay. And we were talking about potentially 500 in half that time, in 6 months.
Oh, wow.
So we were very, very concerned. We brought on extra staff. We stocked up on additional supplies. We really thought this could be horrific, and it could have been horrific. I don't know about you, but my position on why we didn't have those numbers here is really luck. If I mean,
I'm going to slightly disagree.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, it's not just luck, of course.
Yeah.
But what I would say, I guess, is, God forbid we had an outbreak in one of our nursing facilities where there's a large number of Jewish community members. I think our numbers would have ended up being very different. Or had we had congregations that insisted on remaining open with indoor services the first several months, I think the numbers could have been very different. So I think there were smart decisions probably made, along with maybe a little bit of luck. that didn't make that happen. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say numbers wise to wrap up this question. There's another factor perhaps, which is that there are people who passed away out of town from COVID or COVID related deaths who might in a normal period of time, a normal era, have been buried in Cincinnati. But given the situation with the pandemic, bodies were not being transported in that manner. In some cases, in some places, they were insisting on cremations at certain periods of time. So I think that that may have accounted for a small number of a lower number being buried in that year than normally. But again, it was a very busy year, but it was just not as busy as we anticipated.
So I think for me, I think it's the bigger factors that are not exclusive to the Jewish community. I think it's Ohio specific. And even though I think the first, if memory serves correctly, I think the very first COVID case in Ohio was a Cleveland person who went to APAC, the APAC conference in March 2020.
That's right.
So it could have spread incredibly quickly, but I honestly think that Ohio, it was incredibly mitigated largely by the actions of Governor DeWine and Dr. Acton.
I agree.
And they sort of shut things down as soon as we had 3 cases in the entire state. They said, you know what, everything needs to shut down. So that's where I disagree about the luck. I think it's actually,
you're right.
And they had the political will, the political ability at the time. And, by the time Dr. Acton left office in June 2020, the cases were just incredibly low. And I think it was largely due to their actions that helped save hundreds, if not thousands of Ohioan lives. So that's not a specifically Jewish thing. It's just an Ohio thing. At the same time, it's funny. I still remember there being, even though I think almost every synagogue shut down in March 2020, there was one that kept going and people were coming in and out of town for bar bat mitzvahs and people were catching it, but by and large, I think people shut down and we're not in person. So I think it greatly mitigated the numbers that we could have seen.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree. You're right. I mean, DeWine and Acton are sort of out of sight, out of mind at this point for me. But yes, they really were phenomenal, I have to say, in how they managed things. And I do believe that they saved thousands of lives.
Yeah. And then already, I mean, yes, the numbers popped back up after Dr. Acton left office. We saw what happened certainly by the fall of 2020, but we already started learning more things, that not everything transmitted by touching things. There were masking was more became more popular by the fall. So, so it's not entirely luck, but I think there is something to be said about what you were saying. The Jewish community tended to be more careful with these matters. And certainly when vaccinations rolled around early 2021, people they availed themselves of the life-saving measures of taking the vaccination.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I guess what I really meant is that regardless of what the reason was that it didn't occur, we are very fortunate that we did not have an outbreak in one of our nursing facilities where there could have been, a number of casualties.
Right. Although that could have gone back to the Ohio Department of Health and the protocols they had in place, which goes back to Dr. Acton. So
no, I mean, again, not to discredit, why it happened, but just, thank goodness it didn't, because, one outbreak in one of our facilities that has a high number of Jewish community members, not to mention other community members, right, like could have just been really catastrophic. And I don't think that, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe certainly not in Cincinnati, I don't believe there was any major outbreak in a nursing facility.
Right. Not as bad as
not
some
like
other places.
Yeah.
Were there any other observations, thoughts, things that you saw with cemeteries, burials, anything else that was, I think, unique to the pandemic?
The two things I'll say, one I sort of already mentioned, which was, I think the community, and then certainly I give a lot of credit to our clergy members. People really did see and understand the incredible role that the JCGC staff plays in our community and how essential they really are and how they put their lives on the line to provide a service that we all depend upon. That was very special. The other thing I'll say that, in some ways, I guess is connected is that I don't think, and this was true, this is a conversation that's occurring with my colleagues around the country, we never really took into consideration how difficult this role that we play can be on all of us in this field. It is something that we, carry a lot of weight on, and it is trying at times, and it is difficult. And so recognizing the need for our own mental health and care is really important.
I was going to add, especially in your position where it's a time of grief, people passed away, people are going to be incredibly emotional as it is without the added pandemic layer. So that,
yeah, it just sort of heightened our awareness of that, I think, as an industry, that there is, as a field, that there is this additional need that we really have to provide for ourselves.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
No, this was super fun. Thank you.
Awesome.
I know I thought there was nothing to talk about, and I've blabbered on for an hour.
I think, and you probably only scratched the tip of the iceberg with this. All right. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing about these 2 years of the pandemic with Jewish cemeteries here in Cincinnati. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, wisdom, and knowledge.
Thank you, Drew. It was really my pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.